How did you make the leap then into public affairs?
Well, we had been at Princeton for about 16 years. I was one of the senior administrators. Princeton had a president, a vice president, and then 4 major deans, one for the faculty, one for undergraduates, one for the graduate students, and one for research. So it was the thing for research was a legacy of World War II, when the person who had been aware that nuclear bomb and so on was going to influence, there's going to be much more government support for research in universities, and Princeton wanted to make sure that it only took the right kind of money. And he went back to Princeton, where he was chairman of physics, and he created a university research board. Princeton is most unusual in having rules that say, yes, we want people to be doing good research, but we want it to be basic research. And it was actually, and I think it probably still is, it may not be simply developing a product, which is very much against the temper of some of the times today, but that's the sort of place it was.
So fundamental research coupled with teaching.
Yeah, and I took over that job for several years, and when the president retired in the late 90s, there was a lot of change. I could have become the provost at Princeton. I could have stopped being engaged with, and basically Judith and I felt it was time for another change. All the time I had been at Princeton, I used to spend the summers, a month or 6 weeks, in England at the Imperial College Field Station, where I had met Richard Southwood, who was one of the other people, like Robert MacArthur, who had put together a superb group and who had been very encouraging when I first got involved. And so I moved to Britain, to Imperial College, and that's where we're still in Britain, except these days we're based in Oxford, rather than when I moved to Oxford, because Richard Southwood had moved to Oxford at that point. And then, that was a very good move for us.
And then you were approached to be chief scientific advisor?
Very odd. I mean, there were many people who, when I was approached in this way, felt that the headhunters, and it was the top, the history of this particular job is an interesting one, and let me just begin with that. There was in the Labour Party in Britain in the 1990s a very interesting figure behind the scenes called Jeremy Bray. He was a very original thinker and not interested in political advancement. And he convinced Neil Kinnock. The position of chief scientific advisor of the government had been hugely important in World War II, and in the subsequent years it went down and down until in the 1970s it was half a day a week when the person who held the job met not with the Prime Minister but with his policy group. And Mrs. Thatcher began to bring it back up again. She created an advisory committee on science and technology, and she had a very good person as her advisor. But Jeremy Bray went beyond this, and he suggested to Neil Kinnock, who was expected to win the Labour Party, the election in the early 1980s, that one of the manifesto commitments would be to create a formal office of science and technology, bring in someone from outside and appoint them at the top level in the civil service, grade 1 permanent secretary level, so they would have real clout in the hierarchical civil service, and give them an appropriate staff of about 130 people to do the things they'd want to do. When they lost the election, a Tory peer, William Waldegrave, who was a very good friend of science, convinced the winner, John Major, as Prime Minister, to implement the Labour Party manifesto.
They stole the idea.
And that was then done in, I think, 1993-94. And they hired the most expensive headhunting team, and I was one of the people they put forward. And in fact, the chap who interviewed me from the headhunters, in a way that I thought was nice but peculiar, at the end said he told me he thought I was the best person for the job, which I thought was pretty weird, I never having done anything like that. And most of my friends were torn. Some admired the risk-taking abilities of the government in doing this, and others thought it confirmed that the government didn't really know what it was doing. But I actually think it went rather well.
Yeah. And you were thrown immediately into several crises?
I enjoyed it very much, and there were some quite interesting excitements on my watch, as there have been on later ones. One of them motivated me to do what I think was the most important thing I did in the 5 years that the appointment was for, which was to actually issue protocols for science advice in policy making. Because there is a tendency for, one has to understand that the Chief Scientific Advisor's job is essentially to tell you what the facts are that constrain the political process of deciding what to do. But ultimately, the science advisor can't tell you simply what you should do. They can only set out what are the facts, which point maybe to a particular action, but you're painting the backdrop for, as it were, a drama on which the play will then be acted out as a democratic process in Parliament.
But isn't it true? I mean, science works on the basis of skepticism and questioning, and that's sometimes very difficult to portray to a different audience.
Absolutely, and sometimes people want to hear the answer that they would like to hear,
exactly,
and are not as welcoming as they might be to being told that that's not the right answer, even though they may. It's not the job of the chief scientist to say, it's not the right answer, here's the right answer, this is what you must do. You point out that you think it's not the best, but you've got to respect the democratic process. But we have a very good example recently in my successor's successor, or no, just somebody who chaired a committee for government to report on whether their classification of drugs should be softened so that things like ecstasy wouldn't be so rigorously penalised. And the facts pointed in that direction, but it's not surprising that the government didn't accept the thing, because there's a lot of political factors surrounding that. And personally, as a citizen, and thinking of my children, I would rather not have ecstasy declassified, as it were. But this particular science advisor made a huge fuss that his advice wasn't taken, which I thought was most inappropriate.